Good afternoon, and welcome to the 5 Expensive Mistakes in IBM Licensing, presented by Miro Consulting. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Miro. Joining me today is Sharon Trembely, Senior Analyst at Miro. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please use the questions box in your webinar control panel, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. A little bit about us here at Miro. We specialize in IBM license management, IBM audit defense, and IBM cloud services. We also provide the same services for Microsoft and Oracle and Adobe. All your questions will be kept confidential and only visible to us, the presenters. With that, Sharon, can you take us away?
Sure, Sean. This is Sharon Trembly. I'm a senior analyst here at Miro Consulting, and I specialize in IBM licensing, and I also help out with the Oracle licensing at times too, because they have some similar tricks. From audits with IBM, I've noticed some actual experiences where people have overlooked their IBM licensing. And Miro's experience with audits and licensing reviews are consistent that clients are not blatantly or recklessly installing IBM's intellectual property, but there's often unknowns or misunderstandings. IBM's Passport Advantage Agreement is the umbrella licensing agreement for almost all of your software if you don't have mainframe. IBM defines their licensing metrics, and as the vendor, they get the privilege of defining how they measure their licensing. So you, as the client, cannot redefine their software metric. The third one is hardware refreshes. They do happen over time. With some software licensing dependent on the hardware it's installed on, you need to keep that in mind. The fourth one is virtualization. Virtualization isn't a major factor with IBM's license metric tool in use, but if it isn't, full capacity licensing may be calculated at a higher license count than you expected. And then there's a lot, IBM has very specific product rules and tables for each software product, and it may even change between versions. So you should always keep refreshing your knowledge on that. Or double checking it with IBM. Okay, the first one was IBM's Passport Advantage Agreement, and it's a lot of important stuff is in there, like IBM's right to audit you, and also that license shortfalls could be assessed with 2 years back support, and that's in Section 112. The definition of subcapacity and how you get subcapacity by using their IBM License Metric Tool, or ILMT. If you're not using it, you're full capacity by default, and historically that was the way they were licensing it before ILMT came along. And if you have a virtualized environment, this is going to be a big deal to get subcapacity or to realize that you'll be calculated at full capacity. And that's going to be in the Passport Advantage Agreement, that's Sections 113 and 114. If you have questions about pricing, IBM is very methodical about that with their points and RSVP levels. And when you go up and down levels to get better pricing, or your pricing gets a little higher, and that's in Section 111. There's rules regarding support, or what IBM calls IBM subscription and support, in Section 318. And if you want to do drop wall support or keep wall on support, those are two acceptable states, but there's that in between where you really want to keep everything you're actively using on support and not cut it down too fine if you're trying to save some money, because that would be an audit, not a compliance issue. And there's also some information in there with appliances and software as a service and the complete enterprise options within the Passport Advantage Agreement. It's only 9 pages long, and 2 pages are country-specific rules, so it's not terribly onerous to read that. A little more information about what full capacity is that I just mentioned in the Passport Advantage Agreement. By default, everyone is full capacity. and that's going to apply to all your licenses that are processor value units, your resource value units where the resources are defined as your managed cores, and there's now a couple socket licensing. So programs in a virtualized environment and your client's reporting responsibilities in the subcapacity terms will be voided if you don't use their tool. Or let's say you haven't installed all the agents, they'll do a partial and make those servers full capacity for counting them. And you could use lots of excuses with ILMT to say, oh, it's too hard to use, it's too time consuming, I don't have the resources, I have a firewall, I fear it phoning home to IBM, and it has to talk to IBM just to get the license definitions. If it never gets the license definitions, it won't work. So you could use all these excuses, but IBM's response is your full capacity. Or you use something else, like if you want to have an idea for a different tool or alternative method, you could ask IBM for an exception, and they will grant it in writing if they give it to you. But if you do nothing, you're going to remain at full capacity. And I just put together like a little slide on how subcapacity works, just in case you're, thinking, oh, I'll just do full capacity and no problem. Although staying with the default method of full capacity seems to be easy to do, if you use virtualization such as VMware, even IBM's own LPARs, or any Hyper-V or something like that, you could license only the virtual cores allocated rather than the entire physical server by installing ILMT. So I worked up a simple example with only 3 physical host servers, and they're clustered together to allow the 6 virtual machines the ability to move between the 3 hosts. So if we have DB2, some WAS and MQ on some of them, with ILMT and subcapacity, we'd only need to license PVUs for the virtual cores allocated. If ILMT is not in use, full capacity would still apply. So if you just want to license 1 core of DB2, 7 of MQ, and 5 of WAS, that would definitely save you on licensing. But if you were at full capacity, you'd need to license all 12 cores for all 3 hosts. So that's the difference. And that could be surprising if you didn't realize that you needed ILMT during an audit situation. There's you can appeal to IBM and their auditors, but you get the basic idea here of how virtualization and full capacity is not a good mix. Not having time to read the Passport Advantage Agreement and the notification emails is not an acceptable excuse to IBM. If that's truly the case, then you would think you were at full capacity as you were 10 years ago. If you've never read anything, didn't hear anything, so that's why it's a weak excuse. I mean, you can use it, but it's not gonna. IBM's not gonna concede it easily. Okay, the next thing I'm going to cover is the IBM license metrics, because they have very similar ones to other vendors, user-based ones, and they have authorized users, the floating ones, employees, and they have a tricky one called user value unit where you use a table. The authorized user is whoever you give access to in the program, whether they use it or not. As soon as you give them access, they need to be licensed. When you download a copy of the program, it's up to you to either grant or prevent access to your employees, contractors, and external users. The key point there is you've granted access. That's where IBM wants you to license the users. Specific terms such as infrequent, internal, external, etc., are defined within the specific software listing. It can change with migration or version changes, though. So what was true a couple of years ago might not be true today. They might have changed it. If the program has an infrequent user definition to allow for like a ratio of 10 infrequent users, only need one license, you need to have a method to track usage to prove that a user meets the definition of an infrequent user. Burden of proof is on you. If everyone who is in your LDAP is given access with no mechanism to count usage, all users listed in your LDAP need a full user license. Also keep in mind that using only LDAP as the gatekeeper may expose additional software to your employees that they never use. You need to have additional restrictions in place because software like Cognos comes with a default everyone permission group. So, not all your employees are going to use Cognos, but you'll be found at fault in an audit situation or a software license review that you've allowed the possibility that they could use it. And don't mistake the ability to use an adequate number of licenses or floating and concurrent users. Some software prevents extra users, but others allow it. The number for licensing will be your high watermark if nothing keeps additional users from logging on and using the product. IBM has a very specific or very IBM-centric metric for CEO communications, which is your complete enterprise option, where you get Domino at a reduced or Lotus at a reduced bundle rate. You're therefore obliged to license all employees in your company who've been assigned a computer capable of running the software. This is an improvement over employee if you have employees without computers like manufacturing or seasonal employees who work or people that work outside. But if you have a division of your company on Outlook, you need to ask IBM for an exception when signing up for CEO Communications Bundle, because without that written exception, you have no exception. And don't forget, if you have external or web access to applications, you're still going to need Domino Utility. CEO Communications user doesn't cover that usage. Okay, server-based metrics. Most of us know the processor value unit, the PVU, and the similar sounding resource value unit, RVU, is based on a defined resource within the software description. At first, it was just managed cores, so that kind of made it kind of easy just to count out the managed cores on the servers. But now RVU has been expanded, so resources could be people, could be probes, could be devices, and then RVUs uses a tiered table that I'll explain later. It confuses some people with the math. IBM's also come up with a token metric, which is like a license key, but it covers a family of products with a check-in, check-out process. It doesn't allow excess uses. That's nice for compliance, because you can't allow extra users to get it without having their available tokens. And then also you have to be careful if you're dropping partial support with license keys, because if you're using license keys, sometimes when support is dropped, you forget to remove the excess license keys. If it's a audit finding that the keys were not removed, it's not terrible, because all IBM will ask you to do is reinstate support for those licenses. But it's something you probably don't want being found during an audit at all if you haven't been using it. And I found one case where someone was trying to change their license metric by changing their purchase order to IBM. IBM will see that as your error rather than an attempt at migrating a license that they ignored. So you need IBM's agreement for any software license migration. You cannot turn your $4 external user licenses into $800 employee user licenses by making a mistake on your purchase order. IBM won't agree to that. This is a couple of IBM's processor value unit tables. And this is where they license per the cores on your hardware. I took a couple snips from the two tables that IBM has online. The first one's been around for a while. It's the for a Power Series machine in turquoise. And if I had software on a P-Series S824, that bottom row in turquoise, it would be 70 PVUs per core. And then I'd license the number of processor cores by the 70. So if I had 2 processors, 4 cores for each, that would be 8 times 70, or 560. Later, IBM came out with the Intel table, which is a little different, and because it's on the same web page, it's confused some people because it's not just straight across the row. Most of the Intel Xeons are listed in this that middle section, if all the model numbers. But if you'll see that there's a new column on the right that addresses the number of sockets. And most companies are using those 2-socket blade servers now, which are 70 PVUs per core. But you need to remember that if you bought a 4-socket or processor box, it's 100 PVUs per core. I think I ran into that recently where I even forgot momentarily. I was just very agreeable. That's 70 each. But that's going to make a big difference with licensing. If you have 2 20-core processors, or 40 times 70, it's 2,800 PVUs. But if you have 4 10-core processors, that's 40 times 100, which is 4,000 PVUs. So that makes a big difference, even though it was probably not intentionally you bought the hardware that way, thinking about your IBM licensing, whether to get the 2-core box or the 4-core box. And I just put together a little illustration to show the difference between PVUs and RVUs. Initially, RVUs were the managed cores, but now it could be a list of payees, monitor devices, terabytes of storage, etc. So just an illustration of what is meant by managed cores is for PVUs, you license the application server. For RVUs, you're licensing the hardware of the managed servers. So we're going to count up those cores instead. So if it's managed cores or managed servers, we're counting what it's watching. If it's PVUs, it's where it's installed. Okay, and there's just a quick look at IBM's tiered tables, because it looks like it's an easy table to use, but you just don't go to your number and then multiply everything by that factor. The tiered table works with you have to fill up each tier before you move on to the next one. So both resource value units and user value units use a tiered table to convert to the licenses required. Each software product has its own table, and there might be further things within the definition that create different tables. There might be one for employees, there might be one for external users, so you have to read the software carefully and how to license it. The licensing is, as I said, a progressive tier system where you'll receive better value if you have a large number of resources or users. For users, there's sometimes those multiple tables, so you have to make sure you're looking at the right one, whether it's employees or external users for that product. Sometimes IBM makes it clearer for you how to calculate it, and other times it may be a table that might be accidentally misused in a calculation. The methodology is the same, though, no matter which format IBM presents your table in. So in this example, I took, this is for Netcool Omnibus, where let's say we're monitoring voice over IP phones. If we have 2,500 phones, we just break down the math. So, the first tier, you're licensing 100, or, the 2,500, and then you just start filling in the tiers. So you have 2,500 resources, but then when you add the multipliers for each tier, you only need 1,285 RVU licenses. And some people might just glance at the table and say, oh yeah, I got more than 2,000 servers and or phones, and multiply it by 0.3. So that's a simple mistake, but it could hurt you in the the long run if there was an audit. Okay. I guess the gotcha point on a lot of things is once you get your IBM software down, and you're like, I'm perfect. things will happen. There's always change. Your hardware can change. Your virtualization could change. You could throw things in the cloud. The license definition could change. The license bundling can change. And then IBM's always buying companies and then blue washing the metrics. So when you thought you were good, not anymore. So with the PVU example, I used the popular blade servers. Whether they're a 2 or a 4 socket makes a difference to your license count. Adding virtualization or changing virtualization methods could expose a full capacity license environment to a huge risk. The possibility exists that each virtual instance could be on a separate physical host in your vCenter, starting with the largest piece of hardware. That can be exponentially increase the number of licenses they would expect you to have. As new versions of software are issued, there may be a change to the counting rules for them. Version-specific rules can also change, and the tier tables can also change for the user value units and the resource value units. With IBM, sometimes the bundles are broken up, and then they're also grouped back together in suites. So it goes both ways. And then when IBM requires another software company, they update the license metrics. IBM does both license migrations and allows clients to retain legacy contracts, but you have to pay attention to what situation you're in, because you may have employees or administrators that know the old method very well, and then you did the migration with IBM and they're still thinking about the old method. And license migrations happen with little notification to IBM clients. You can sign up for update emails or monitor Passport Advantage to see your changes. If you've never objected or renewed support year after year, it's a poor defense during an audit to say you never agreed to a license migration. And then there's also IBM's disaster recovery rules. This has been pretty much the same for a long time, but specific software rules will always take precedent over the general rules. We have our hot DR, where you're processing requests and doing work, which most people consider a high availability. Warm, where it's started but not processing requests, which is idle standby. And then cold is not started. Don't generalize IBM's DR rules without double-checking your specific software licensing requirements. If software has nothing contrary listed in its disaster recovery rules, the general rule of thumb would be license the hot standbys. But I can't stress it enough. Make sure the software doesn't have a conflicting rule, and it may be product specific. Okay, and I ran into this with during an audit. This was a very specific product rule, but it immensely inflated the number of licenses they need. It's also Netcool Omnibus again. That's my new favorite product with IBM. Is they had one base install, and that's where their database resides, and that's just licensed by install. Then they had 5,000 event basic devices, which could be our voice over IP phones, licensed by RVU. Then they had another 20,000 probes monitoring servers, routers, switches, and then they had 10 to higher level probes monitoring their email systems. But then they set up a high availability DR off-site. One more server. That's all it was. One more server. And then that triggered, you must obtain additional RVU entitlements for all your resources managed by the program. So they needed another 5,000 basic devices, 20,000 probes for the servers, routers, and switches, and then another 10 for their email systems. It doubled everything just for having a second server monitoring them. So that was a terrible rule for them to trip over, but we sorted it out in the end.
Thank you, Sharon. And that will wrap up today's presentation. If you have any further questions or would like a one-on-one session, please email us at sales@miroconsulting.com or call us at 732-738-8511 or visit us on the web at miroconsulting.com. That concludes today's broadcast. Have a great day.